Hello, everyone, and welcome to my YouTube channel. It is an absolute pleasure to have today with us a very good friend, Daniel Hannan. Hi, Dan. How are you?
Very, very nice to be with you, Daniel. Speaking to you, in fact, from Kingsclear, which is a little village in Hampshire.
Beautiful. Dan, I would like to start actually with your book, How We Invented Freedom and Why It Matters. The pandemic has given probably too many opportunities to governments all over the world to use the crisis as an opportunity to reduce individual freedom and to take over levels of control that were probably impossible to imagine a few years ago. How do you see the situation in terms of freedom globally in developed economies and the risks and opportunities that may come from what we have lived in 2020?
That's an incredibly important question, Daniel, and I'm afraid rather a depressing one. I can't see very many opportunities in it. I mean, the story of the growth of the state, in a way, is the story of a succession of crises, each one of which is accompanied by a massive expansion of state power that is somehow never quite completely undone when the crisis has passed. And that's partly because bureaucracies are reluctant to relinquish power, so that the state seizes control on a supposedly contingent basis and then finds it very inconvenient ever to return to the status quo ante. But it's also, frankly, because a crisis changes our brain chemistry. The perception of a common threat makes us warier, more demanding of authority, of hierarchy, more intolerant of difference. We're thrown back onto some very kind of caveman instincts. So if I think of the last time in the UK where we faced the perception of a common threat on this scale, I think I have to go back to the Second World War.
Yeah.
And if you look at what happened after 1945, it's not a great story. You know, the country was still in a conscription mobilization mindset, and the electorate was not just prepared to put up with, but was demanding state controls that would have been difficult to conceive before 1940. So we had identity cards until 1952. We had food rationing until 1954. We had full conscription until 1960. All of these things had been brought in supposedly just to deal with the Nazi threat. We had, when you look at the economic controls, frankly, we had most of them in place until the Thatcher reforms in the 1980s. And in some aspects of healthcare and education, we still have them now. So long after the emergency passes, you find that the dial doesn't quite move back. And the worst of it was this, and this I think is a really terrifying parallel with our own era. The last time we had debt on this level was after the Second World War. You know, we borrowed then as now, as every country has done now, to get through the crisis. But of course, in 1945, the feeling of the country was we've earned something better, right? We've been through 5 years of wartime privation and sacrifice. Now we need a more generous welfare system, a more generous healthcare system, more generous pensions, et cetera, et cetera. And so at the time when we could least afford it, when our treasury was empty and our credit exhausted, we embarked after 1945 on a massive expansion of government spending. And I'm afraid I see the same dynamic today. You know, you don't hear many politicians saying we should start abolishing this or that bit of spending that was brought in just for the coronavirus. You know, on the contrary, you can see, well, whatever it is, you know, grants to charities, grants to businesses, loans, you know, higher public sector pay, higher benefits. People are saying, even as the health crisis passes, oh, we need to keep this going. And where I'm afraid finding, what we always find in these situations, it's very easy to spin the spending taps open. It's much harder to screw them tight again.
And one of the risks that I see, for example, is that with the incredible monetary expansion that we are seeing, on the one hand, you see governments are increasing in size very dramatically. They are the first beneficiaries of the newly created money. And then once that newly created money starts to generate some inflation, what we hear from politicians themselves is that we need to raise taxes in order to reduce the inflationary pressures, which is a double way of increasing government size, on the way in by increasing expenditure and on the way out by taxing citizens. We're hearing comments from Ms. Yellen in the United States about a global minimum corporate tax, particularly now in the United Kingdom. How do you see that threat to the more dynamic economies?
That's, again, a very, very good question, Daniel. I mean, we have been here before as well, right? After 1945, governments decided to get rid of the debt by inflating it away, basically. I mean, I'm simplifying a little bit, but only a little bit. In 1945, we had this huge debt, and successive governments, Labour and Conservative, inflated it away, which had a knock-on impact on competitiveness and productivity, and brought us in the end to the complete downfall of the early 1970s, which was our lowest moment as a country. Governments always prefer inflation to tax rises, right? Because inflation is somehow seen by the voters as a kind of act of nature, right? Rather than an immediate consequence of government policy, which is what it is. But really, when a government uses inflation to reduce its debt, that is a particularly vicious tax and a brutal, arbitrary tax on the people who least deserve it. You're right. You know, we should be the urgent need now is for the global economy to get back to normal, for companies to hire and expand. We should be cutting taxes on business, particularly taxes on employment and investment. We should be doing everything we can to avoid a spiral of unemployment. But of course, governments never want to do that. They would much rather raise taxes than cut spending, right? I mean, of course, it's much more pleasant from their point of view. And so, hence this idea that, as you say, Janet Yellen is pushing, but the EU loves it. You know, France and Germany have been pushing for this for a decade or more. The OECD has a similar proposal, a less ambitious one, but this idea of minimum rate of corporation taxes, harmonized business taxes. And I think there are two really important points to make about this. First of all, I mean, this may sound like a really basic point, and it's, in a way, it's incredible that it needs saying, but it does need saying. All taxes are paid by human beings, right? A business tax is no more paid by the business than my TV license fee is paid by the TV set, or the petrol tax is paid by my car. All taxes are paid by human beings, in this case by employees, by shareholders, by suppliers, and by customers, which is to say all of us, right? It's an arbitrary and nasty tax. Second, the biggest constraint on a high spending government is international competition, right? There's a point at which you can't raise the tax anymore because the money goes to friendlier jurisdictions. And hence the ambition down the ages for people who believe in big government to try and have these minimum standards is what the EU did for a long time, not just on tax policy, but on social policy. And now, of course, with Biden in the White House, they are taking that ambition global. But the thing I would say is competitive taxes, and particularly competitive business taxes, are the surest way for a poor country to get rich. It worked for Hong Kong and Singapore after the Second World War. It worked, we saw it in our lifetimes, work for a number of post-communist countries in Europe in the 1990s. They priced themselves into the market with competitive business regulatory and fiscal regimes. If we take that route away, we take away a solid route for poor people to become middle-class global consumers.
Absolutely. One of the things that I think as well is this is ultimately a very protectionist measure. Ms. Yellen, on the one hand, says businesses should not worry about paying 28% corporate tax, as if they didn't pay taxes, you know, on sales, on capital, on jobs, and on equipment, etc., etc. At the same time, she wants a global minimum corporate tax. So she knows that there is a negative impact. It's interesting that it's a way of making the more dynamic countries suffer in an environment in which they don't have multinationals and they don't have the large corporations that the United States or some of the European Union countries have. No, the other thing that I think is I would say ironic, to say the least, is that I hear consistently that these taxes are needed to cut the deficit, while at the same time they say that deficits don't matter because the government does not go bankrupt and can borrow and monetize it endlessly.
Yeah, wouldn't that be great? I mean, but what were we thinking? All of those thousands of years that human beings wrestled with the problem of limited resources, all we needed to do was print more money. Why has nobody thought of this before? I mean, it is truly incredible to me that this version of modern monetary theory, I mean, to be fair to the exponents of modern monetary theory, they don't actually say that debt doesn't matter, but the half understood version of it, which predominates among leftist politicians, is that debt doesn't matter. Well, okay, great. In that case, do you know what? Why don't we cancel all taxation, right? Why don't we just print all the money we need? I mean, it's unbelievable that we have to have this conversation. And by the way, unbelievable that we don't stop to think about what the impact of higher business taxes are on business, right?
Yeah.
It's the most basic thing. You tax the things you don't like, right? If you want to get rid of them, if a tax on carbon emissions reduces carbon emissions and a tax on tobacco reduces smoking, what do you think a tax on business will do?
Absolutely. When you think about that globalization of interventionism and the risks that we see to freedom, etc., I think it's worth now for our viewers to understand your point of view regarding a very contentious issue, which is Brexit. The vast majority of our viewers are probably in favor of the European Union and very much in favor of the Eurozone, how it has been created, etc. I would like to get a little bit of a summary of what you express in this book, which I think is absolutely key for anybody that wants to at least have a well-written and well-argued argument about the Brexit. What is the situation now, and how do you see the UK economy moving now that Brexit has been at least, I would say, 95% completed? No, we still have the financial agreement, but it's basically everything, no?
Sure. Well, I mean, Brexit has been completed. Look, first of all, I sympathize with your views. If I were not in the UK, and if I were relying for my sense of what was happening in the UK on the Financial Times, The Economist, the BBC, or worst of all, the New York Times, I would also be very anti-Brexit. I mean, how could you not be if those were your sources of information? I would believe that Brexit was nativist, nostalgic, anti-immigrant, possibly racist, certainly based around some kind of drawing up of the drawbridge, some kind of withdrawal from the modern global system. Believe me, had that been the Leave campaign, we wouldn't have won. The UK has always been an outlier in its support for free trade and free enterprise. And Brexit was not a British form of Trumpism. A big part of Trump's pitch was, I don't want to have these trade deals with China. A big part of Vote Leave was, we do want to have these trade deals. The EU isn't having them, and as an independent country, we can have a more open market. And so far, we have. I mean, as I speak to you now, we have trade deals in place with 67 states, not counting the deal we have with the EU. We are negotiating very ambitious and comprehensive free trade agreements with Australia and New Zealand, which I expect to conclude within the next few weeks. We are It's a slower process, but we are beginning actually, we've made some progress in trade talks with the United States, which of course the EU dropped with the end of the TTIP. We're talking to Mercosur, we're talking to the GCC countries. I'm confident that if we have another conversation like this in a year's time, that the UK will be a more liberal market economy than the EU is, as measured by trade liberalization measures. I've no doubt of that, because when we joined the EU, we had to apply a lot of protectionist tariffs, and particularly in coal, steel, textiles, but above all, agriculture. So I've people who think as you do in the UK, most, not everyone, but most kind of free market libertarian types voted leave for that reason. Mm-hmm. Now, how is it going? Well, look, it was going very well, right? It was, unemployment had fallen to a record low. We had more startups launched since the vote than in the equivalent period before it. The stock exchange was high, property values were strong, growth was strong, manufacturing was up, exports were, everything was going very well. And then, of course, this wrecking ball came in from the side, the coronavirus and the associated closures. And I mean, it's kind of annoying in a way, because it means I can never prove definitively that Brexit was a financial success, because what's happened with the virus dwarfs. I mean, Daniel, frankly, if you take the most optimistic predictions of the most cheerful leavers and the worst fears of the most depressed remainers, the distance between them is trivial compared to what we've suffered, as you have, as every country has, with the coronavirus. But all the more important, as we come out of the lockdown and as we come out of the closures, that we don't slide into protectionism. And you can see it happening, I can see it happening in every country, in North America, in South America, in Europe. But for the reasons I was giving earlier, the psychological changes, the caveman heuristics, the number of people who are emotionally and understandably responding to the coronavirus by demanding a degree of autarky and protectionism that they would have regarded as absurd even 2 years ago. The number of people who have said to me, oh, surely even you, Hannan, even you must accept that we need to grow more of our own food. I mean, come on, seriously? That's what you get from the I'll tell you something. This is we're recording at the beginning of May, right? Yeah. It was when the lockdown was at its worst this time last year. This time of year in Britain, we basically don't produce any food. Right? It's what farmers call the hungry gap, right? We've reached the end of our winter harvests. No more potatoes, turnips, cabbages, right? We haven't reached the first of the summer harvests. So what do we make from late March to early May? Asparagus, rhubarb, purple sprouting broccoli, right? We would have starved had we not been able to import what we wanted from a diversity of suppliers. And I mean, again, this was a point that you struggled, but you could make it before the coronavirus. Now it's much harder. Food security, like anything else, doesn't mean growing all the stuff yourself. You're just as vulnerable, you're more vulnerable to a localized shock. Food security means being able to purchase from a wide range of different suppliers globally, the way that Singapore or something like that, right? And this is true also of vaccines or protective equipment or whatever else. You'd have thought that this scramble for buying vaccines would have finally cured people of the mercantilist idea that exports are good and imports are bad. But no, because people have been thrown back onto these caveman instincts that, I've got to hoard my stuff so that I can get through the winter. And I'm afraid this is going to last long after the economies are open again, long after the disease has ceased to be unusually virulent. We're still going to be stuck in a more protectionist, more statist world. And the prospects for people like you and me who believe in personal freedom and free markets, I think, are going to be pretty grim.
On the other hand, we are witnessing an extraordinary change in the perception of how government manages the areas in which government has a monopoly. like the healthcare crisis. No, we have seen in countries that are extremely inclined to statism, as Argentina or Spain itself. People get really angry about how government has not only managed the healthcare crisis, but the vaccination rollout. Do you think that tying up with government attachment to managing everything at any cost, the vaccination rollout of the UK has been an incredible thing compared
okay,
to...
so that's a really, really interesting point.
Yeah.
What is obvious to you as an economist is not, I think, obvious to the general public. So to give you a very broad view of what happened in the UK when it came to procurement, initially it was a disaster.
Yeah.
Our attempts to purchase masks, gloves, gowns was appalling. Ventilators, we were incredibly slow. We have an Argentine type state-run healthcare system, and we went through all of the usual procedures, and there was producer capture, there was a refusal to use the private sector, a distrust of any private testing, etc. Disaster. We did not make that mistake with vaccines. The Prime Minister had the wisdom with vaccines to get someone from the private sector and say, go and do this. She understands she's been in this world of venture capital in pharma for a long time. Brilliant woman called Kate Bingham. And she ignored the bureaucracy. She went straight to all the CEOs whose numbers she had. And as you say, the vaccination program was an incredible success here. I mean, it wasn't the best in the world, but it was the best of a big country with the logistical difficulties by some measure. So rationally, you would look at that and say, well, then what you should learn from that is not to bother with all the state bureaucracy, right? Don't go through all these hoops of statutory consultation procedures and all the rest. But that is not, I'm afraid, how the British press or the British public see it. It's almost bad form to make any criticism of the healthcare system here.
Yeah,
it's been elevated to this kind of special place, and so the way in which the media covered the failures of the NHS procurement was by this neat little sidestep, where whenever they said something bad, the NHS would be called the government. So the story would always be presented as the government is failing to get the protective equipment that nurses need. Yeah. As though a bunch of politicians are sitting there saying, don't send it to the nurses. It's never explained why they would want to do this. But, and this is done because, I don't know, it's just too much of an imaginative leap for people to say that although the nurses are lovely people, the system under which they work is not treating them very well or getting the most out of them. And it would have been a more responsive system if it were a little bit less monolithic. But I think the coming out of this crisis, the mood now is the National Health Service has earned itself a medal, everyone in it has earned a huge pay rise, and any further talk of reform is now, who could possibly, and the only people who could want to reform our wonderful NHS would be, Monty Burns and Dracula and the rest of the Springfield Republican Party in the cause of evil, and I'm afraid that again is just part of the statism that we're going to be living with for a while.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting, as you know, I live between Spain and the UK. When I'm in the UK, I always hear that the NHS is the best healthcare system in the world. When I'm here in Spain, I hear that we have the best healthcare system in the world. When I go to Belgium, it's the best healthcare system in the world. There's a real problem with the rankings.
Yeah, I mean, Belgium is quite good, to be fair. It's one of the few things that works really well in Belgium. And to be fair about the NHS here, because it was set up as a Second World War kind of, it was a product of a conscription mindset. The one thing it's really good at is a centralized national vaccination program.
Oh, right? Absolutely.
We finally found something where it really does lead the world, because that was kind of, that it's an unusual circumstance. But I think the reason that people do that, Daniel, I've noticed the same thing. People always want to say that. It's because the kinds of people who become doctors and nurses are generally very nice people.
Absolutely.
They are people, right? A certain kind of, you and I may be curmudgeonly, grouchy writers and analysts. But somebody who has a great bedside manner and so they are naturally drawn to it. So we all like them, of course we do. And it seems therefore somehow ungrateful. It seems as though if you criticize the system, you're somehow criticizing the men and women who work in it. And that makes people reluctant to do it. But in the UK, there's an extra problem that I don't think exists really anywhere else. I mean, our healthcare system is an outlier in that it really is completely funded by taxation. It's completely state-run. There's no insurance element. There's no private element. So, apart from Cuba or somewhere, you would struggle to find a system run on the same lines as ours. Now, that makes it very attractive to a certain kind of radical socialist, because it's the one properly socialist bit of government. Contribution according to ability, distribution according to need, right? And they have been brilliant at conscripting the passive support of people who don't particularly care about what method there is, but whose personal experiences have been fine, who are grateful because they've come away with their, knee fixed or whatever. And so that second, much bigger constituency gets, is like a sort of, it gets used by the smaller radical one to make this massive majority against change.
When you look at the next steps for Brexit, so that our viewers can understand what is what is in your view where Britain should go to in the next 10 years, as you outline here in this book, what do you think are the, let's say, the top 3-4 things? I mean, no need to count, but the top things that come to mind for you that should, in a way, define the Britain post-Brexit?
Well, the 3 big changes I would make is further devolution of power. Having got power back from Brussels, I don't want to leave it festering with our administrative state. I want to push it downwards and outwards to local councils, or better yet, to private citizens. Deregulation. A lot of EU directives and regulations are driven by cartels, by producer interests, and of course, we will still have that problem. There's nothing special about us. We will also have the problem of producer capture, but at least we won't have bad regulations driven by producers in another country, right? Where you have restrictions on what you can do because there is a company in Belgium that happens to meet some standard. So we have some capacity for deregulation, or at the very least for not regulating as fast as the EU will going forward. And then, of course, the third and biggest one is trade. I expect Britain within the next 12 months to join the, as it's now called, the CPTPP, the Pacific Trade Nexus. Now, your viewers might be thinking, hang on, how is Britain a Pacific country? And it is certainly true that, other than in the technical sense that we do own the Pitcairn Islands, which are pretty much in the middle of the Pacific, we are not a Pacific nation. But we have exceptionally strong cultural links to some existing members, to Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Singapore, and so on. There were 2 arguments that I made for Brexit pre-coronavirus that I think have been strengthened by the experience of the past 15 months. One was that the EU was shrinking as a share of the world economy. Now, that's a demographic process. It's partly developing countries catching up, but it's been accelerated by the asymmetric impact of the pandemic. We talk about it as a global pandemic, but Europe and South America have been much worse hit than Africa or Asia or Australia or whatever. So I think that the EU is going to emerge further behind in global terms than it was, and that makes a close trading relationship with the relatively affected and more successful Pacific economies more attractive. The second big change is we are all much more used to what we're doing now, what you and I are doing at this moment, right? We're much more accustomed, much readier than we were 18 months ago to have important conversations on Zoom or on Teams, to have serious, sensitive business conversations because we have no option. And I don't think that's going to change. That's not going to be undone when international travel begins again. The idea that British businessmen will be as ready as before to fly over to Dusseldorf for the day to make a presentation, I just don't buy it. So once everyone is making commercial deals like this, suddenly geographical proximity stops mattering, and the cultural proximity that ties us to a number of common law English-speaking countries, which tend to be growing faster than the EU, that becomes more important. So those two things, the relative economic growth of non-European markets and the ease with which we now do business across huge distances, I think those have both strengthened the global arguments for Brexit that we were making before the coronavirus.
You've already addressed the issue of so-called alleged nationalism behind Brexit as a myth, but I would like you to, if you don't mind, it would be great if you could talk to me about a few things that I read quite a lot. The first one would be being pro-Brexit means that you want the European Union to disappear. What would you say to that?
Well, look, there were 17.4 million people who voted for Brexit. Some of them were communists, some of them were libertarians, and most were in between, right? So I'm sure that you will find within the 17.4 million, some people who want the EU to disappear, some people who want the EU to flourish without Britain, and most who are, again, in between those two poles. So I can only speak for myself. I would like to have a successful, prosperous, and friendly neighbor. Of course I would. I mean, we're talking about old friends and allies. But you know what? Even if we weren't, even if we were being purely selfish about this, we want to have rich neighbors because that makes them good customers, right? The success of the economic success of a neighboring country is good news for you. It doesn't come at your expense, right? And that's why, and I think that's the view of the UK government. So they've been very supportive of the EU as a concept since we left. But also, we've not, as a government, tried to put any obstacles in the way of EU businesses in the UK. On the contrary, so let's take, in your world, let's take the question of financial services. The EU has made a big point out of not giving equivalence to UK financial services providers. So equivalence means basically it's an agreement that you trust the regulators in the other country, right? And among OECD countries, it's normally just an automatic courtesy. The EU gives equivalence to Mexico, to Brazil, to China, but not to the UK. Now, I don't think there was any conversation here about denying equivalence to EU funds. Why would we want to do that? Right? Why would we want to make it harder for our consumers to access financial services? I think it is sad that the EU is making it harder for some of its firms to access the best and cheapest money markets in the world. But it would be crazy for us to, if you like, retaliate in that sense. And there's a whole bunch of these little issues like that. There was the question, for example, of blockading the export of vaccines. You remember the height?
Oh, I remember, yeah.
So, the EU had a dispute with AstraZeneca. It didn't have a dispute with the UK. But it was raiding unrelated companies, Pfizer factories, in order to try and threaten the supply of exports to the UK. Again, I don't think any mainstream politician here said, well, then we should retaliate by restricting the export of vaccines to the EU. On the contrary, I think we're very, very close now to having a surplus here. And I think there's a general consensus that once we have vaccinated everyone at risk, we would rather be exporting vaccines to vulnerable people overseas than using them all on healthy 20-year-olds here. So in terms of, I can't speak for everyone in the country. There's a heterodoxy of opinion. But in terms of British government policy, I think we have done our best to be good neighbors and allies and trading partners.
When we look at the last elections in the UK, one of the things that surprised the media and the consensus in the European Union was the landslide victory of a Conservative Party with special, especially in areas in which Labour had been seen as having a stronghold, and a lot of the message was basically that it was all down to the Brexit decision, that the message of the Labour Party was not very clear about what they were going to do relative to Brexit, whilst the Conservative Party was very, very clear about it. Do you think that that level of support remains after all this time, and do you think that there has been a shift? Because for example, I read somewhere that I think it was the Daily Telegraph that 1 in every 4 Remainers had changed their view because of the vaccine rollout. Do you think that all of this has changed the landscape of the political discourse in the UK, or do you think that?
Gosh.
Yeah,
that is a very good question. So you are absolutely right, Daniel, that at the 2019 election, there were 2 very unusual factors that worked to my party's benefit. The first was that Labour was run by an unapologetic Marxist. And that's something we've never had in this country before. I mean, Spain has had some fairly extreme politicians on the left down the years. Britain, not really, or at least not in senior positions. So Corbyn was something quite outside what every previous Labour leader had been, forever. That was one exceptional circumstance. The other, as you say, was Brexit. And it wasn't just that people wanted Brexit to happen, although it is certainly the case that a lot of Labour voters switched because of that issue. It was something else. It was that Labour MPs had been elected in 2017, promising to respect the result, and then the moment they got in, started frustrating it. They had basically been dishonest. And it wasn't just that they were being dishonest, they were kind of insulting people's intelligence, right? Because they were treating people like fools. Their strategy for 2 years was to do everything they could to frustrate Brexit, to vote against even the most basic sort of measures to prepare for no deal or whatever, to try and block and wreck everything. And then to turn around and go, oh, look, it's a terrible mess. This is much harder than you said it would be, right? And of course, everyone could see that was because of how they behaved. People don't like being treated as idiots, and I think there was a very justified sense among a lot of working people in the North and Midlands of England that Labour had treated them like idiots, that they'd been dismissed as kind of unsophisticated proles who wouldn't be able to follow this, and they were absolutely understandably angry about that. So here's the interesting question, right? Neither of those 2 factors really still pertains. Brexit is a done deal, and Keir Starmer is a normal Labour leader. How much of those gains will we hold? And the answer is we're not going to hold them forever. I mean, no party does that. But so far, we are doing much better than you might have expected. As I speak to you, we are tomorrow expecting the biggest, if you like, midterm elections in American terms, the biggest elections in Scotland and London and local councils and so on. And the signs are that the Conservatives are still ahead, which is not normal for a government that's halfway through. And I think what we're seeing is a slight realignment, a little bit like in the United States, where the Conservatives are now much more a natural choice for, if you like, the sort of patriotic working classes. The Labour Party has become cut off from the kind of people who used to vote for it. It's become so obsessed with identity politics and minority rights and issues that are pretty tangential in large parts of the UK. And that's opened the door to the Conservatives to win a lot of seats that they've not held before. All of which, I'm sorry to harp on this depressing theme, but all of it rather reinforces my reasons for being gloomy about the prospects of libertarianism, because I have to say, Thatcherism has become a kind of a minority pursuit, not in every sense. I mean, Boris is pro-enterprise and wants to cut taxes where we can, but what you and I and she would have regarded as the moral case for individualism, for trusting people rather than collectives, I think that's become a very unfashionable ideology now.
But what I would recommend every one of you that is watching is to look at the details of the video below. In the details, you will have the bibliography of Daniel and his contact. You can follow him on social media. You will also have his Twitter handle and his different social media handles. It's a must follow account. So Daniel, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for addressing very, very interesting issues, and look forward to continue in the dialogue with you.
Well, thank you, Daniel. It's always a pleasure. Thank you for everything you do as well. And pues que te vaya bien.
Igualmente, un fuerte abrazo. Thank you for watching this video. Please subscribe to my channel, like my videos, leave your comments below, and keep defending freedom. Thank you very much.